a friend gave me a book for my birthday, and it was a book about the evolution of the English language. And if that doesn't sound interesting to you, I don't know what to say. I think that's one of the most interesting things in the world, like how this weird language that we speak, that's kind of got loan words from almost every other language, has evolved over the centuries. And so, words mean one thing and then they mean something else. Anyway, sometimes we don't think very much about it, but in the foreword to that book, I read this fascinating little story about a British traveler who visited the island of Anholt, I think it is, sometime in the 1940s. Now, Anholt is a tiny little island right in the middle of the sea that separates Denmark and Sweden in Northern Europe. It's a really popular tourist destination, or at least it was in the 1940s, but very few people live there. Its permanent population is like 150 people. So during their visit to Anholt in the 1940s, this British tourist noticed that the children of the island liked to sing funny little nursery rhymes, including this one that I have on a slide, and it went like this. Jack og Jill went up the hill. I don't speak Danish or whatever they speak on Anholt. Og Jill come tumbling after. Well, there's more, that's the ellipsis. But the kids who repeated those words, like most of the permanent residents of the island of Anholt, spoke Danish. So they had no clue what the words meant, but they sang them anyway. Now, by way of an explanation, the traveler learned that back during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 1800s, the British Army had spent some time occupying the island of Anholt. And so soldiers had taught their popular English nursery rhymes to the children there, and almost 150 years later, the words had been passed down from generation to generation, repeated again and again, even though people didn't understand what they were saying. Now, when you stop and think about that for just a moment, those singing children of Anholt weren't really doing anything too peculiar, because every single one of us, we all adopt words and phrases and customs and practices as they've been passed along to us, and we adopt them even if we're not entirely sure what they mean. We count like this, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Anybody know what that means? When we say eeny, meeny, miny, mo, we never stop to think that maybe we're speaking in like an ancient Welsh dialect, or maybe ancient Greek, or, as some researchers suggest, it could even be Swahili. I think it's pretty Welsh, Greek, Swahili, that's all pretty far removed, which is just the academic way of saying, we don't have a clue, right? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, who knows? We just say it. And it doesn't stop us from saying it that we don't know what it means. More than being just like an interesting little story, I think this tells us, this is kind of a parable for some of the ways that we practice and express our faith, right? It can even be a metaphor for the way that we do church, because when you take a story like this, and when you consider the effect that repetition and time can have on meaning, and then maybe you want to ask yourself, why do we as a community of faith, generally in the Christian tradition, use the language that we use? What are we saying when we repeat words and language that have been passed down to us across centuries and centuries? How often and how deeply do we reflect on the meaning of Christian language, or Christian lingo, or Christianese, as sometimes I like to call it? There are things we say in church that we don't say anyplace else. I don't know. It don't make a lot of sense. I talked about this not long ago when I talked about the prodigal son. You remember that? None of us has ever used the word prodigal, I don't think, outside. Anyway, you already heard that sermon. I think these are good questions to hold in mind as we think together about the opening passages in the New Testament book of Mark. We're here in the middle of the season of Advent. And this year at MCC Toronto, we're spending the 4 Sundays of Advent looking together at the first 4 books of the Christian scriptures, what we generally call the New Testament. And we're focusing together on what those 4 books tell us about the beginnings of Jesus. Because in some of those stories of the beginnings of Jesus, there are very familiar passages about Christmas. Now, you got all this in this morning's theme conversation, which I had a lot of fun doing. When we think of the beginnings of Jesus, when we think of the way the Bible tells those stories, we think about Mary and Joseph and that night they spent in a stable because there was no room at the inn. We think about angels and their song. We think about shepherds and their sheep. We think about wise men and their gifts. We think about that bright star of Bethlehem. And of course, we also think about the baby Jesus laid in a manger or a feed trough in a stable where he was born. That's the Christmas story, right? As we know it from the Bible. The thing is, not all the books of the Bible that tell the stories of Jesus' life begin with Jesus as a baby. And the stories that we do repeat this time of year about the baby Jesus are sort of pieced together from parts of different books. Last week, Reverend Dina shared a lesson for life based on the opening chapter of the book of Matthew. Now, Matthew is where we get the story of the Magi, the wise men from the east, and the star that they follow to find the child Jesus. Matthew also goes into detail about Jesus' family tree because the writer of Matthew wants us to understand that whatever divine work is happening in Jesus, and there's a lot of big stuff happening in Jesus, it's part of something that's been happening all across human history from generation to generation to generation. Now, next week, we're going to hear a lesson for life based on the book of Luke, which is really, that's kind of the sweet spot if you're doing this Advent preaching series, because that's where we get the manger and the shepherds and the angels and those classic lines given to us in Old English translations of Scripture. And she brought forth her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling clothes, laid him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. I don't know, maybe swaddling clothes and manger are 2 of those words we probably don't say unless we're at church. I don't know. I grew up on a farm. We never called it a manger. It was always just a feed trough. So, King James for the win, again, as always. Matthew and Luke gives us so much to work with in this season of the year. Those 2 accounts of the life of Jesus are the reason that our nativity scenes look the way they do. And then there's Mark. When it comes to the stories that we call Christmas stories, Mark gives us nothing. There is no baby Jesus. There is no infant Jesus. There is no miraculous birth. There are no angels to sing about it. There is no manger. There's no Mary and Joseph. Well, actually, Mary does show up in chapter 3 of Mark, the passage that Timothy read to us earlier, but it's not to celebrate the birth of her son. It's not to sing about God's favor. It's actually to say, Jesus, you need to come back home because people say you've lost your mind and that you're possessed by demons. That's not the Mary that we meet at the manger, but that's the Mary that Mark tells us about. I don't know if you could rewrite the song Mary Did You Know based on Mark's gospel, but like, Mary, did you know that your son is not actually possessed by the devil? I don't know that would sell. Maybe try it. So I think you can understand why the book of Mark tends to stay on the shelf come December, right? So why on earth am I up here talking about Mark? I promise y'all it's not because I'm the junior member of the clergy team. It's not because I drew the short straw. At least I don't think that's the reason. I don't think. It's just luck or bad luck of the draw, I guess. I don't know. I think, though, the bigger question for us today is if we're going to look at the book of Mark together, here on this second season of Advent, then what, if anything, does Mark's telling of the Jesus story have to do with Advent? And okay, I think I do have an answer for that one. And I think it has to do with the language we use, with some of those thoughts I shared at the very beginning of the message, the story about Jack and Jill and Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Moe. Because you see, all of the best scholarship around the Christian scriptures points to the fact that Mark was written earlier than Matthew, Luke, and John. Okay? I think anytime that Dina or Jeff or I lead Bible study and we're talking about the Gospels, we tend to say, Mark is the earliest of the Gospels to be written. And most people nod their heads at this point. Maybe not everybody knows that, but just in case you've never heard it before, as best we can tell, those first 4 books of the Bible that tell the stories of Jesus, the first one to be written down by, 20 years? 15, 20 years? Is probably Mark. Yeah. So it's the first one to be written. It's the oldest and it's also the shortest. Now, it may be that at the time that the writer of Mark set out to tell the story of Jesus, he wasn't entirely aware of the parts of the story that covered his birth in Bethlehem. The important part of the Jesus story, as the Gospels tell it, comes towards the end where Jesus dies and is raised from the dead. It's not so much at the beginning. Although the beginning is important, they really want to get the stuff at the end right. So maybe Mark just didn't know about Bethlehem. Maybe Mark didn't know about the stars and the shepherds and the wise men. And if he did know, maybe he just decided, I don't need to include this part. What Mark did know is that the stories of Jesus were stories about the entire world changing. Maybe you noticed this as Timothy was reading just a moment ago, but I found it was more noticeable in Timothy's passage than in the one I read. But the grammar of the passage he read was pretty bad. That's not on him. One of the things that, if you go to seminary and study the New Testament, sooner or later, whether you come to read the language of Greek or not, which I never really did, somebody's going to tell you, whoever wrote the book of Mark was only barely literate. The syntax, the grammar in the oldest versions of Mark is just really bad. It's a lot of fragments, it's a lot of verbs that don't agree with the subjects, it's a lot of it's not written well. If you were an English teacher and somebody were to put the Gospel of Mark on your desk, it would be covered in red ink. It's not very well written. Now, we don't know this generally because translators of the Bible into English tend to fix things up a bit. They don't change the meaning, they just make the grammar sound better. So if all you've ever read is the King James Bible, you would think that the writer of Mark was pretty much William Shakespeare, when in fact, he was barely literate. So there's a Bible scholar who created a new translation of the Gospel of Mark about 5 years ago. And he said, you know what? Well, in the entire New Testament, he said, you know what? If the Greek's bad, I'm going to translate it into bad English. And I think that's brilliant. I really do. Because it kind of gives you this sense of authenticity and urgency. And so in the foreword to this translation, the scholar, whose name is David Bentley Hart, said, Mark isn't exactly the best writer, but here's what he did know. Mark understood that history has been invaded by God in Christ in such a way that nothing can ever stay the way it was, and that all terms of human community and conduct have been altered on the deepest levels. So here's a person that maybe doesn't know how to write with a lot of eloquence, doesn't know how to put a fancy sentence together, but he knows that in the stories of this person, Jesus, everything has changed. Hart, the translator, goes on to say, Mark contains lots of awkward writing, but that's evidence of a deeper truth in these texts. These are not beguiling exercises in suasive rhetoric or feats of literary virtuosity. Rather, they are chiefly the devout and urgent attempts of often, or rather ordinary persons to communicate something seen and heard that transcends any language, but that nevertheless demands to be spoken now, here, in whatever words one can marshal. I'm not sure that whoever gave us the Gospel of Mark, whoever wrote it, woke up one morning and said, you know what, I'm going to write a book that's going to be read for the next 2,000 years. He wasn't trying to write a bestseller. He wasn't, that wasn't his priority. He just knew there's something about these stories of Jesus that I've got to tell, that I've got to share, and I've got to get them out, even though maybe I'm not the best communicator. Because Mark's the first of the first 4 books of the Bible, because it's the earliest gospel, it's actually the first book about Jesus that uses the word gospel to describe itself. And that's one of those words I think that we've been using for so long, we don't always think about what it means. When I think about gospel, I think the first thing I think about is gospel singing or gospel music. My grandfather sang tenor in a gospel quartet. He sang very high, actually. Where's Abraham? Didn't sing as high as Abraham, but he sang pretty high. I have a picture of them up on my wall, and that's gospel music. It's a whole genre of music. There are these things called gospel tracts that if you grew up in the evangelical world, you remember those. Adina and I talked about those in Bible study on Tuesday, and they're these little booklets that, essentially give kind of a recipe for going to heaven, as if there is any such thing as a recipe for going to heaven. When we think of gospel, we think about a lot of different things. Sometimes when I think about gospel, I think of these old confessions of faith that are point by point. Here's what we believe about the beginning of the universe. Here's what we believe about the afterlife. Here's what we believe about the relationship of, the way the relationship of men and women ought to be. Here's what we believe about this and this and this and this. And it's like paragraph 1, article 1, sentence 1, A, B, C, D. When the writer of Mark uses the word gospel, what he means is, I'm about to tell you a story, and at the center of this story is a person, a human being named Jesus, who Mark tells us at the beginning is the Son of God. So Mark recognizes he's more than just a human being, but this is a story. It's not a doctrinal laundry list. It's not a genre of whatever. It's just a story about people. And in these stories of this person who invites people to change, the world is totally different, and God's dream for the world is coming true. Gospel is a story that changes the world. And that's what Advent is. Our nativity scenes look the way they look, whether they're authentic or not, or whether they cobble everything together or not. It's a story that's being told there, and it's a story that changes the entire world. That's what Advent's about. It's about the great good news, the best news you've ever heard, the news that the world has changed, and that you can change too. Amen.